Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Terrence Hinton, and I want to welcome you to today's webinar presented by Santa Barbara County America's Job Center of California. So the title of today's presentation is It Takes a Village, Understanding the Intersection of Community Partners and Job Readiness Centers and its Impact on Workforce Development Strategies and WIOA Funding for Justice-Involved Citizens. And as I said before, I'm Dr. Terrence Hinton. I am a workforce and reentry consultant for Medlin Workforce and Reentry Solutions. So just to give you a little bit of information about myself before we get started here today, I currently have over 10 plus years of public and nonprofit administration and management experience. And I've worked in a various number of roles within the public sector. My area of expertise is reentry workforce development. And when we talk about reentry, I'm talking about my area of specialty is working with people who have been involved with the justice system in some way, shape, or form, whether they've been incarcerated in prison, they're out on parole, or maybe they've been out in the community for several years, and they still have issues of finding employment. I have an expertise in helping those individuals find not just employment, but suitable employment that they can support themselves and their family. I have to date, I've worked with over 2,500 individuals who have been justice involved throughout the United States. And as I said before, I'm a consultant for Medlin Workforce Reentry Solutions. I also am a professor of criminal justice and public administration. I currently teach in the sociology department at The Ohio State University. I also teach adjunct classes within the public administration department at Franklin University. And I also serve at an online university called Columbia Southern University in the criminal justice department. And particularly when I was speaking about my nonprofit experience and management experience, my most recent employer, I served as a former reentry program for a workforce development program that I'm about to talk with you about shortly here. And if you want to contact me, if you ever have any other further questions, you can contact me here at terrence.hinton2426@gmail.com, or you can also visit my LinkedIn page for additional information. So, to give you a brief overview of what I'm going to discuss here in the next 60 minutes, first thing we're going to talk about is a background of the EDGE program. It stands for Empower Development by Gaining Employment. It was a workforce development program that I managed, and really the reason why I'm going to talk with you all about that today is that it really sets the stage in the background for WIOA funding, because that was part of our program. And so I'm going to walk you through that process. I'm also going to talk to you about what it's like for individuals who have a background, a felony in their background. If any of you are experiencing that, or you've worked with this population, this is something that's very familiar with you all. But I'm going to talk about just the main portions of that and why it's important to understand as you move forward in this process when we talk about getting WIOA funding. We're then going to dive into briefly the WIOA guidelines and clarity in the process. One of the things that I found was that there's not a lot of clarity. And we're going to talk about some of those things and what really needs to happen in order for a client that you serve, or if you're the individual yourself seeking the WIOA funding, these are the things that you need to know before you go through the process. Then I'm going to talk about this is certainly something that takes a team. This is not something that a person can do by themselves. It definitely takes what I call a village of people coming together, particularly when you are talking about serving populations that might be underserved. So I'm going to talk about some of the things that need to happen in order to more streamline that process and getting a client from point A to point B in regards to WIOA funding. And then I'm going to conclude what happens when you put all this together and what does it look like. So what do I hope for you to get out of today's? lesson? Well, a couple of things. The first thing is I hope this information advances the development of whether you are somebody who is in the profession where you work with other individuals. Maybe you're a workforce development specialist, or you're a manager, a nonprofit administrator, or a caseworker, or somebody who's looking to get this help, that this will advance the practices that you already have in place. So I'm not trying to necessarily reinvent the wheel of what you might already be doing and what is already working, but just to give you a more panoramic view of how this process works and maybe to help you more streamline your operations. Secondly, I do hope that after this presentation, you'll be able to understand WIOA and how it applies to serving people who have been involved in the justice system. And we're going to talk about, so WIOA not only serves people who have been justice involved. There's a lot of other guidelines, and it serves a lot of other different populations, right? So I don't want you to think that this is simply just for reentry people. This is applicable for a number of individuals, but particularly because of the nature of the work that I do, and we're talking about reentry, a lot of the things I'm going to talk about do apply to people who might have some sort of criminal record in their background. Also, and I mentioned this before, understanding the importance of the village, the strategic partnerships, the communication, the collaboration and coordination, and the partnerships that must take place in order to more streamline this WIO process. And at the end of the day, again, I'm not trying to reinvent the wheel here, but I just want to improve what you're already doing, and basically delivering it based off of evidence-based human service programs, and simply empowering those individuals to build successful and more productive lives. So to give you a little bit of background, again, I said before I was a reentry program manager. I was a program manager for a nonprofit agency called Alvis Incorporated, which is located in Columbus, Ohio. And what they do, Alvis has been in the business for over 50 years of providing programming that is evidence-based to people who have been involved with the justice system. And so Alvis provides a number of services in the area of reentry, behavioral health, substance abuse, recovery housing for children, as well as services to people with developmental disabilities, and helping those individuals to live more of an independent life within the community. And again, everything that Alvis does is based off of evidence-based human service programming. And so there's more information here if you want to learn more about Alvis. I mentioned them for a reason, because everything that I'm telling you is based off of things that I have experienced being a program manager myself within the nonprofit world. So now we're going to get a little bit more specific. And again, the reason why I'm giving you this information first is because the program that I ran last year was very successful. And I'm going to get into, the number of barriers that we came across, but a lot of the things that I'm going to talk to you about today, the EDGE program and how I ran it, this forms the basis of why I'm telling you what must happen when it comes to WIOA funding. This is based off of mistakes that I made, things that I did well, and also things that I didn't do well that I learned from. And so this is really very much a hands-on approach to the things that did go right in my program, and moving forward for you all, no matter what position you're looking at this from, as a workforce development specialist, caseworker, or the individual who's receiving these services. These are things that you need to know as you go through this process. And so with the EDGE program, it was a brand new program. Again, it was a 5-month workforce development program, helping individuals with criminal justice involvement to overcome those barriers to skilled employment opportunities. And I'm going to talk about what those barriers are, because there are a number of them when you've been involved with the criminal justice system. And so this program was funded in coordination with the City of Columbus and the Workforce Development Board of Central Ohio. So it was a brand new initiative, brand new program, and it started in January of 2020 of last year. And it ran from January of 2020 to June of 2020. We took a 2-month break. We revamped in August of 2020, and it went all the way until January of 2021. And the one thing that was different about this program was that it was really holistic in nature. So it wasn't just addressing the job readiness barrier for clients, but also if our clients had substance abuse, if they had child support, if it was mental health, whatever the situation was, we would refer those clients out so that they could receive those services as well. Because we know from research that if you do not address those other barriers that the client might have, then it doesn't matter what kind of employment you get them, they will end up phasing out. So it was very much a holistic program. So we're going to shift gears here. Some of this information you may already know, but again, this is awareness, right? And one of the things that we must know is that when justice-involved citizens leave prison, or they have a misdemeanor or a felony, or even if you've been arrested, it could be very damaging to your prospects, particularly when it comes to employment. I will tell you, you would be surprised at how many people, when you talk about whether it's arrest, felony, misdemeanor, you'll be surprised at how many people have that. In fact, currently more than 70 million Americans have some sort of record, which can result in disqualification for good paying jobs. I see this all the time. And again, this is not to suggest that some of those barriers are not understandable, but a lot of these barriers, and I don't have the time to talk about, there's a lot of other collateral consequences that will impact individuals long after they've served their sentence in time, 15, 20, even 30 years down the road, where they can't do certain things because of something that they did 30 or 40 years ago. And with that, we're always telling individuals, you always hear, so many people who are released from prison, they end up going back, and we always want to know why. Well, these are the reasons why. In addition to employment, people struggle with substance abuse, mental health, housing, again, barriers to education. If you've been incarcerated, you haven't looked for a job in years, and so where do you start? And so there's poor job search and interview skills, and basic computer skills is probably one of the biggest ones. That's a webinar in and of itself that I could talk about in regards to taking a client who has never had any kind of technology experience, and how to get them trained to where they can use a computer independently on their own so that they can even apply for jobs. Again, one of the issues, and if you've noticed on the outline, I said, I see you have a felony. Can you tell me about that? That is one of the first things that when I'm working with clients, when we work with clients one-on-one, we talk about that, because when you undergo a background, it's one of the first things that's going to come up. It's the biggest sticking point for a lot of my clients is the background. A lot of my clients have a lot of other issues, but there are a lot of my clients who've been incarcerated who are very skilled, very intelligent, have a lot of education, but that background is a sticking question. And nowadays, a lot of job applications ask prospective employers about their conviction history. If you look at an application, you've probably seen it. Have you ever been convicted of a felony? Or have you ever been convicted of a felony in the last 10 years? Or do you have a criminal record? If so, please discuss. And of course, I know in some states, you have this ban the box that has been passed in legislation, which is great, but that's just the first step, right? Because even if an employer, even if they do not ask you that question, if you proceed through the employment process and they like you, eventually everybody runs a background check. So whether it comes up on the application or it comes up in the background check, it's something that clients are still going to have to address. And so that's why we work with clients to help them understand, how do you properly communicate those questions regarding their conviction history. And a lot of times, how you answer that question is key to whether or not you end up getting the job. And I've seen a lot of success stories from clients who had pretty violent charges, but because of how they addressed the question, the employer was willing to give them an opportunity. So what's the point of all of this? Why did I spend the last 15 minutes telling you this information? Well, number one, employment is an extremely important part of successful reentry. Okay. It also provides stability, generational impact, improved mental health, empowerment, stronger positive relationships. And for these individuals who do find suitable employment, they're less likely to reoffend. So when we're talking about the importance of getting people employed or getting them a credential, this is just bigger than giving the job. It does impact how they think, how they feel, and whether or not they choose to reoffend. And I know firsthand what happens when they don't. This is not to suggest that employment is the only thing that will keep people from reoffending. And I want to be clear on that, that the reentry aspect of it as it pertains to employment, that's only one piece, or one small piece of what might be a bigger puzzle, but it is a big piece. And so this is very important for you to know that the impact of a client or an individual who has been justice involved is a big deal getting a job. So to be honest, I come across this a lot with people when I'm telling them why is this important. And when I give them the same response, they say, okay, well, so what? Okay, well, if you don't necessarily care about that individual, that's your prerogative. But what I do point out is shutting people out with criminal records doesn't just affect them, it does affect you and it affects everybody, including our economy. And again, shutting people out of the criminal records, people with criminal records, shutting them out of the workforce, it costs the United States up to 87 billion in lost gross domestic product every year. And so when you talk about the impact of choosing for people who don't have jobs, it becomes a big deal. And that's not to mention when you're talking about you're losing people from the income tax base, um, people who are contributing, when it also comes to people who may be locked up in prison or incarcerated, that costs money. There's a bevy of other things that it costs individuals uh, for people who are not employed. So this is very much uh, a we problem that does impact everybody. And that is why it's important for you to know. So now we're going to start to talk about WIOA. Many of you may already even know what WIOA is, but I'm going to cover some basic things here before we dive deeper. And so the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, it was signed into law mid-July in 2014. And the whole point of this was to increase opportunities for individuals, particularly those with barriers to employment. And I highlight this here for a reason, because when we talk about barriers to employment, that can fall under a number of different categories. Again, for the sake of this conversation, in my area of expertise, we are talking about people who might have a criminal background. Okay, it also does serves for another of other functions, including supporting the alignment of workforce development, education, and economic development systems. One big one is it provides people with the skills and credentials to secure and advance employment. And so I'm going to talk about this later, but one of the things about the EDGE program that I oversaw last year was that through WIOA funding, we could work with our clients on getting them industry recognized credentials at no cost to the agency so that they can advance their employment opportunities. And that's where WIOA came into play for us. And I'm going to cover that here shortly. Again, promoting the improvement in the structure and delivery of services. And the big thing is increasing the employment retention and earnings. Again, I do want to touch on something briefly. With the EDGE program and in general, it's not just critical for a justice involved citizen to get a job, but get a good job. There are jobs out there right now. I mean, currently 8 million jobs available right now due to the pandemic, and we're talking about unemployment. But yeah, there are a lot of jobs out there that pay $9 an hour. Sure, a client, many of the clients that I work with, they could go get a job making $9, $10 an hour. But we all know that to be able to live in any city, to be able to live and function, have an apartment, rent, insurance, car, not even talking about having a family and kids, you have to be making a lot more than that. And so WIOA steps in to provide those opportunities for credentialing so that those credentials that the client receives through WIOA funding can help them obtain better employment prospects and better earnings so that they can make a living for themselves. So who does WIOA serve? And oftentimes people are a bit surprised when they really look at, and again, you can find this on the WIOA website, but you'll be surprised at who WIOA serves, because essentially it's a large portion of the population. Adults over the age of 18 who are eligible to work in the United States of America, and if applicable, register for the Selective Service. That's a big one. Please make sure you must be registered for the Selective Service to receive WIOA funding. And if you want to know if you've registered for the Selective Service, you can actually look at that online yourself in Google. Type in Selective Service registration or check a registration Selective Service. And literally all you have to do is you have to type in, I believe, your first and last name, date of birth, and your social security number, and it will pull up your number and it will tell you if you're registered or not. If you're registered, you'll have a number, and if you're not registered, it will let you know that. So you can find that out very quickly on your own. So adults over the age of 18, dislocated workers who have lost their job through no fault of their own. So if you were simply just laid off, and we saw that last year with the pandemic, where millions of people were laid off through no fault of their own, you're eligible. Young adults from 14 to 24 who are deficient in basic skills, don't have a home, need a high school diploma or a GED. Again, I talked about restored citizens or people who may have a criminal background, low income, runaway, foster child, pregnant or parenting. And as you can see, there's a number of people and categories that this falls under: English language learner, physical or mental impairment. Okay, so there's a lot of different areas that WIOA falls under. And so I say that to say this: no matter where you're at, if you think that when you look at this, maybe you don't apply, I would encourage you to go to your nearest jobs readiness center, which I'm going to talk about here briefly, and you can find out. From what my experience last year with a lot of the clients that I spoke with and I worked with, I made the mistake of assuming that they didn't fit the criteria based off of these guidelines. But what I found out is when you really get to work with a caseworker, it is a case-by-case basis. There's some judgment calls in there. There's a little bit of leeway. Now, they're not going to tell you that, but there is some gray areas that people can work with depending upon the situation. So don't necessarily disqualify yourself based off of what you have here. I would always pick up the phone and call and set up an appointment just to verify that and make sure. And the beautiful thing about WIOA is, where is it offered? It's offered everywhere in the United States. All 50 states offer this. There are job centers within in every state, and then virtually all your big cities. Every city that I know of has some sort of job readiness center, a community center, or workforce development board where you can get more information of this. And if I had the time, this really another webinar, I could show you how to search for those tools online, because I've done it for many of my clients who might live in other states, but they all have the same services. The guidelines in regards to where you find this information is different, but everybody has it. So a couple of things I want to talk about. So I just gave you the basis of what WIOA is, who it serves, and some of the basic guidelines. So last year when I went through this program, there was a process that was put in place for our program. And I had 34 participants. And what you find, and what I found, is with each individual, everybody was on a different spectrum. Everybody was on a different level. I worked with some clients who had a lot of education. I worked with some clients who had zero education. Some were had all their criteria in order, and some wanted to go to school. Some have been employed before, some had never had a job before in their life. And again, a lot of my clients wanted to go into different industries. And so that was a process that it took. There was a process that was involved in really trying to get that client from point A to point B. And so what I found though was that there was no way that I could do this on my own. And I haven't brought it up yet, but I told you this program started in January of 2020, my very first program, and it ended in June of 2020, the very first cohort. Well, we know in about mid-March, we know what happened. The world shut down. And so if you can imagine for a workforce development program, the bottom line is getting clients employed. And then all of a sudden in the month of March, everything shuts down and we have the worst unemployment since the Great Depression in the month of May. Just how challenging it became for me as a manager, trying to figure out what we were going to do moving forward and how we were going to make this work. And so long story short, as I'll share with you later on in the presentation, we did make it work, but it involved partnerships. Okay, so my Ohio Means Jobs, Job Readiness Center, Central Workforce Development Board of Central Ohio, nonprofit organizations, vocational schools, traditional universities, employers, technology centers. I had to work with individuals from all of these areas in order to work with my clients. And again, if you're working with Justice Involved, you cannot forget parole and probation officers and judges, because they are the ones that set the criteria and guidelines for what clients can and can't do. For example, if I have a client that wants his CDL and he wants to drive trucks all over the country, he may not be able to do that if his parole dictates that he stays within state lines. So you need to know that information. You need their buy-in. Bilingual specialists. Again, English might be the primary language in the United States, but you have a lot of people that are Spanish speaking descent. And so that involves getting other people involved who are bilingual. Diversity and inclusion. Me personally, and the agency that I work for and the consulting firm that I work for, we are very big on diversity and inclusion. We work with everyone. I don't care what your race is, your sexual preference, Democrat, Republican, it does not matter. We work with everyone and we serve everybody. And so it takes those type of people, diversity and inclusion associates, and the world is changing. And so when you really work in an inclusive environment, it really takes a village of people. And I put in here many others because that can fall under a large umbrella. These are just the partnerships that I had to form in regards to getting my clients to take those next steps. And so it really takes a village, and that's the village that I'm talking about when we talk about WIOA funding and when we talk about that process. It takes a lot of people to make this work. So the WIOA process, what a lot of people think, and what I initially thought was, client comes in the door or he comes through a workforce development program like mine, and we refer that individual to a job readiness center, and maybe they're taken over by a workforce development specialist, or a talent specialist is what I've heard it's been called in a number of other states. They sign a few papers, and then all of a sudden they get their WIOA funding for whatever credential they want to get to and get employed, and they move about their way. Very straight, very streamlined approach, right? Well, unfortunately, what I found was that it doesn't necessarily work that way. And whether it is promoted that way or not, that's not for me to say, but it's not a streamlined approach. And the reason I bring that up is because a lot of times I noticed that clients would get frustrated because they thought, I'm going to go back here, they thought that that's exactly what this process was. And so then they find out there's a lot of other things that need to be done at this step. And what I found was a lot of clients, they quit because maybe it wasn't properly communicated, maybe they didn't understand. And what you need to understand, this is very much an interdependent process when it comes to obtaining funding. And again, I said this before, this involves the work of not just the Job Readiness Center, but the nonprofit organization that maybe the client's coming from, probation and parole, reentry centers, everybody's got to be on the same page. Workforce development programs, other sources of referrals and individuals. So it is very hard for a client to just walk into the door. And again, with COVID, that wasn't the case for the last year. And so that's the other thing that I had to deal with last year, was that clients were not allowed to just walk into a job readiness center. Everything had to be done online on the telephone. So that just made it even more imperative that these entities work together. And I know a lot of times we all work in our own silos, but for a process of this magnitude, when you're really talking about trying to get a client WIOA funding, there's definitely a number of community partners that have to be involved in order to facilitate that process. So it's very much an interdependent process. So one of the big things I learned as we dive into kind of what I did last year. So the first couple of weeks of my program, we took our clients through job readiness and really the basic skills of developing your resume, how to interview, how to answer that background question, kind of get to know them, try to find out where they're at, do a skills assessment, find out what they're interested in doing, and then take those next steps. Around week 5 or week 6 was when we referred them over to the Job Readiness Center. And again, as part of our program, we offered industry recognized credentials at no charge, no cost. That cost was picked up by WIOA. It was secured by WIOA funding. However, you had to go through the process to be eligible to obtain the funding. And what I found in that process was that it was a lot of communicating and back and forth between myself and the workforce development specialist at the Job Readiness Center, which in this case for me, it was the state of Ohio. Ohio means jobs. In Santa Barbara, it's something else. In Phoenix, Arizona, the Job Readiness Center is going to be called something else, right? But I supervised a team of people. I had my own workforce development specialist and I had my own caseworker. And so because it was such a new program, I was very much involved in that process. And so I had myself, my case manager, corresponding with the workforce development specialist at the Job Readiness Center. And it was a back and forth thing. And so one of the things that I learned is the importance of communication. I highly, highly recommend that before you have a client that you want to refer over, I would personally have a meeting with that workforce development specialist over the phone, over Zoom, regarding the WIOA eligibility criteria in the process. Be clear about the expectations. I will tell you, one of the worst things that you can do is to tell a client that they're going to get WIOA funding, and then you rush them into that process, and then they find out they're not eligible by the workforce talent or the talent development specialist at the Job Readiness Center. And then the client's upset, they think the world's over, when in reality, Job Readiness Centers offer a lot of other areas and avenues to do things. So it's very clear about those expectations. Know up front, when you are talking to a talent development specialist and you're talking about WIOA funding, be very clear who your client is. And so, for example, with myself, I sat down with the talent development specialist who was going to be working with my clients. And I was very clear on, hey, individual A, he has a robbery charge from 10 years ago. Is that going to disqualify him? Client B, maybe he had a theft charge for 5 years ago. Is that going to affect him? I had to be very honest without having to give up a lot of personal information. But for me, again, the sticking point with my clients has always been the background. So I like to get straight to the point because I needed clarity in understanding what we could or couldn't do. Because again, I told you on that previous slide, WIOA serves a variety of populations. However, there are still other criteria that they think about, that they consider when developing funding. So do not think that because you are eligible you may not necessarily you necessarily proceed to the next step. There are still other steps that they may not necessarily list. There's a bevy of paperwork and a bevy of other things that you have to go through. And really, when you think about it, it makes sense. And I've had this before. I had a client that wanted to go into banking work and wanted to work for a bank as a teller. Very intelligent, very good with math. One big problem, they had an armed robbery charge. That's a huge deal working for a bank. So I can't remember what the client was trying to get WIOA funding from, but it was for a credential to be able to work in a bank. Well, WIOA, the workforce talent specialist would not approve of that because of the charge. And that makes sense. So although I'm in the reentry world, I do understand that there are certain things that WIOA will fund and it makes sense, and then certain things won't make sense. So really communicating with that individual and being clear about the expectations, I think is a very positive step. Because of that, individuals who might have a background, and it's almost inevitable, there are going to be certain things that they are not going to be eligible for. So I encourage clients all the time, be flexible and exploring different career pathways. I have some clients that are dead set on getting their CDL to become a truck driver. That's great, but keep your options open. If the nature of your charge, for example, I had a client, he was dead set on that. He had a drug trafficking charge. And understandably, they would not fund that because his drug trafficking charge was actually pretty recent. So we had to take a step back and reassess that situation. So again, be clear about expectations, be honest with your clients, and let them know they need to be flexible, because what they might want to do, they may not be eligible for. Always have that consistent contact between the caseworker and the workforce development specialist regarding updates. And I would say at least once a week. I learned from last year, it is very easy for things to get lost in the shuffle. People miss emails, phone calls, people don't return phone calls back. And then 2 months later, that client is still on step one of the WIOA process. And I found that constantly communicating and keeping both the client and the talent development specialist, keeping everybody in the loop, helps to move things along. Because again, and I'll talk about this later, the WIOA process is a lot of paperwork, and it takes a while to do things as it is. And it is very easy for there to, with miscommunication, it's very easy to have this process delayed even longer. And the beautiful thing about communication now is we've learned it doesn't necessarily have to be face-to-face. I know for a lot of people that might be preferred, but you can also do phone interviews, email, and you can Zoom now. We pretty much relied on Zoom for the last 15 months. And in a lot of ways, it's worked wonders for people. And so the ability for us to communicate now more than ever, it has been made a lot easier. So be sure that you are in constant communication with them. Those parties should be in constant communication with each other. Collaboration. Again, I can't stress this enough. It takes a village. And I showed you on those previous slides how many community partners of people that I had to get in touch with over a course of a year. Collaborate. Again, a lot of programs, a lot of individuals may not go to a job readiness center. They might go to a workforce development program at a nonprofit, and they go through the WIOA process that way. And so for workforce development programs, have monthly webinars regarding the WIOA process. I know at Ohio Means Jobs, they do something similar to that, and they had to during the pandemic because the center was closed. And so they were offering virtual services. Monthly webinars regarding that process so that that information is out there. Now, I will tell you, I'm sure a lot of organizations already do this, but again, really being present and going into more explicit detail about that and giving out that information, those webinars, and recording them so that people have access to that information. Presenting to community partners, again, who have workforce development programs. So I had the Job Readiness Center representative come in, visit via Zoom to talk to my workforce development program participants. That way, everybody was on the same page. And what basically they did was they just basically discussed how the process went to all of my clients. All of my clients, they were socially distanced in the classroom, and we connected live stream via Zoom. with the talent development specialist who was at the job center, and they basically went through the process. They let my clients ask questions at the end. I was there to listen. We took notes. That way, we were all understanding of some of the basic things, because a lot of it is getting paperwork, getting IDs, social security information. And if you are somebody that's been in prison, oftentimes I've found that my clients don't have this information readily available or handy to them. So then they have to go back and take those steps just to get those pieces of documentation before they can even move forward. So collaborating, researching, and networking. Who else is doing this kind of work? Make sure you're getting on LinkedIn, webinars. Again, partnering with other organizations who may be more versed in assisting and referring clients. So I know in the nonprofit space, a lot of times they're competing for the same funding, but there are some nonprofits who do things better, and that's okay. So you might be a nonprofit that works well. You offer workforce development and you offer a bevy of other services, but your specialty is substance abuse counseling, and you do that very well. Your workforce, not so much. Maybe it's something that you want to improve, but where you're at today, there's not a lot you can really do. But maybe the nonprofit next door or 5 miles away, or maybe one of your competitors, maybe they do that very well. Well, there's nothing wrong with picking up the phone and actually collaborating with them and partnering with them to say, hey, can we work something out where we'll refer people to you for your workforce development program if you'll refer people to us for our substance abuse program? And that's basically what I did when it came to recruiting, when it came to the pandemic, was that I collaborated with several other nonprofit agencies. Again, big management picture, budgets are shrinking, COVID changed a lot of that. And so we're being asked to do more with less. And so there's a lot more partnering that has actually been going on now due to the nature of that. And really for the foreseeable future fiscal wise, a lot of nonprofit agencies are having to do this. So collaboration is definitely something you want to keep in mind. Coordination. So you've communicated with the caseworker, the client. We're all on the same page. We're streamlined. You're collaborating. You're forming partnerships. The last part of this, and again, these are concrete steps that I took, is coordinating things. And so, for example, if I am a caseworker for my EDGE program, we went through the WIOA process ourselves. We talked to the workforce talent specialists at the Job Readiness Center. We understood the process. We brought them in. We let them speak to the class. But because we had met with the Job Readiness Center staff up front, we knew what was needed in order for our clients to proceed with the WIOA process. So specifically, if we're talking about being registered for the selective service, ID, birth certificate, social security card, all those things, we knew that information up front. So what we did was, rather than having clients go in, we screened them up front and we asked them questions and provided that initial direction. That way, if a client came to us in our program and said, hey, well, I don't have my ID, well, before we even referred them to the Job Readiness Center, we sent them through that process and referred them to the BMV. Or we looked up this social selective service registration, because we can do that on our own. Anybody can do that. We looked that stuff up front. That way, when we did that, that was less work that the Job Readiness Center staff had to do, because we had already done that up front. Again, because we're communicating, collaborating, the coordination part becomes a lot easier, because now they have that information and we can just forward that information over. And again, I'm talking in pandemic times, we couldn't meet face to face. So that's what we ended up having to do a lot, was getting that information up front. And then all we had to do was scan it and send it over to the talent development specialist. And it really made things more streamlined, right? And so again, when I'm talking about the relevant information, the selective service, does a client have all that? Do they have a GED? They say they have an associate's degree. Do they have a copy of it? Do they have a copy of the GED? And so when I found in doing this, it more streamlined the process. Again, I can't stress enough, the WIOA process is a process and it takes time. I took one client through start to finish. It took 2.5, 3 months. And that was doing things streamlined. It takes time. And essentially, when you are dealing with multiple people, like I was, or you're in a workforce development program, it becomes even more of a streamlined process. And so if you are communicating, if you are collaborating, if you are coordinating, it really makes the process go a lot more smoother. So what happens when you put this all together? And these are the results of my EDGE program last year. So we enrolled 34 people. And again, to be clear, for the first cohort, we had 25 students. And then due to the pandemic, we had to cut down to 9 for the second class. But total for the year, 34 clients. At the end of the program, 30 out of 34 of those clients were employed at an average of $16.50 an hour. Now, you have to understand something. When we talk about these numbers, we're talking about this in the midst of a pandemic. And so I'm very proud of those results because of the circumstances that we faced last year. $16.50 an hour is basically within the city of Columbus what you need to make on a minimum to be able to survive as a single person. So $16.50 an hour may not seem like a lot to people, but if you are somebody who's justice involved and you've been in prison 10, 15, 30 years, $16.50 an hour is a very big deal, and it's a lot of money for them. 26 out of 34 of my clients received industry recognized credentials across 10 different sectors. And so we're talking construction, manufacturing, peer support, real estate, janitorial services, a lot of different industries that our clients receive industry recognized credentials. 3 of my clients ended up completing their GED, and I ended up getting 4 of my clients enrolled in college for their associate's degree in culinary, business, electrical apprenticeship, and real estate certification. And the key, what you need to know here is when we talk about industry recognized credentials, again, these were at no cost to the clients because they were secured and utilized by WIOA funding. Now, WIOA didn't fund all 26 of these, but a lot of these were utilized by WIOA funding at no cost. And so when I talk about the process that I went through, and I waited until the end to show you, this is what happens when you are communicating, collaborating, and coordinating, you get these kind of results. But again, it takes a village of people to be able to do that. So I'm very proud of what we were able to accomplish last year due to the circumstances of the pandemic. But I would even tell you pre-pandemic, the WIOA process is lengthy enough. And so when you add on trying to work with somebody who has a criminal history, and then you add on the pandemic, because then that involves computer technology skills and work with clients, it makes that situation that much harder. So I'm very proud of the work that was done to make this program a success. So much to the point fact that it ended up making gaining media attention. And I believe I have that link here at the end of the presentation that I can show you. So just to recap, again, it's important to know people who have a criminal background face a number of barriers when it comes to getting a job because of what happened in their past. And I would tell you, this could be whether it was 7, 10, 15, 30 years down the road. I've worked with clients that because of something that they did 40 years ago, is disqualifying them for certain things today. That includes access to certain licenses, credentials. It covers a number of areas. Housing is a big one. So when you have a background, and I say a criminal background, but again, as I said, this can be anything. It doesn't have to be a felony. It could be a misdemeanor. It could be a simple arrest can disbar somebody from having any sort of mobility or having any sort of opportunity to better themselves in their situation. Employment is a very important part of a successful reentry. And again, I talked about what employment does for somebody who is justice involved in regards to how it helps them on an individual basis. It helps them mentally, cognitively, emotionally. It also has a generational impact for their family, as well as for their children, and a generational impact from the standpoint of because the father or the mother is working, is more likely that children are going to follow in the same suit, as opposed to if the client is currently incarcerated, it increases the chance that the children will go through the same path. So it's very much a very a generational impact when it comes to uh, helping individuals with backgrounds get employment. So, and again, to reiterate, some people don't necessarily find that important, right? They don't, when you ask the question about whether or not it's important with people with backgrounds to get jobs, some people basically, they don't really think it's important. And what I always highlight here again is that keeping somebody who with a justice involved background out of work costs the United States billions in lost gross domestic product annually. And what I didn't add, and I mentioned this briefly, is not only are you losing that money, you're losing, that goes into increasing the tax base, which impacts you. That means that they're unemployed, which means that they now, if they have kids, they have to go on government assistance, which costs you, the taxpayer, more money. Also, for these people who never get a leg up, they end up staying on government assistance for years on end, which comes on your dime. Uh, it is highly likely that a lot of them will end up being rearrested or reincarcerated again, which also costs a lot of money. And I don't even have it on here, but to imprison somebody, it costs a good deal of money. And it depends on where you're at in the country, but it costs the correction system in the United States is $1 billion industry. And so this whole mentality of lock them up and throw away the key um, is not necessarily the answer here. And again, this is not to say that everybody should be free. I am very much about public safety. I am very much on board with, if you commit a crime that's something against the law, you should do your time and you should serve that time. That being said, once your time is up, you should be afforded the opportunity to make better decisions and advance in your life. And then oftentimes, a lot of my clients don't get that. But continuing to keep a client unemployed, it costs you, and it actually costs you more unemployed, because now you're having to fund them when it comes to government programs, or you're funding them when they're incarcerated again. So it's very much a costly thing to keep people who have been justice involved out of the workforce. We covered WIOA and the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, and how it increases opportunities for displaced individuals. Again, when we talk about displaced individuals, that falls under a number of different categories. And I know, for the sake of the conversation today, we were talking about people who have been, I've been talking a lot about people who have been justice involved. But as you saw in the presentation, there are a lot of other categories that displaced falls under. And so I encourage you all, if you're not sure, if you don't know, if you have doubts, please, by all means, pick up the phone and contact your local job readiness center and set up an appointment and ask those questions. Because what I have found a lot of times, again, it's a case by case basis, and you might very well qualify for that funding. And at the end of the day, WIOA funding, it's government money and it's free to you. So if it's free, you have nothing to lose, at the very least, by picking up the phone and calling and letting a talent development specialist ask you those basic eligibility questions and really assessing your situation. And then they can give you the answer up front. And at the very least, at least you know where you stand. So I encourage you all to do that, to find out. And really, and particularly now with so many jobs available in the United States, I think, and with things starting to open up across the country, the time is now to make that move because there are a lot of openings, there's a lot of jobs, there's a lot of demand. And in fact, I think many of you have seen a lot of states are opting out of the remaining unemployment assistance because they are finding that it's been very challenging to get people to work. Now, that's not the only reason why people are choosing not to go to work. A lot of people do have COVID concerns, which are valid, but they are finding that the unemployment piece is disincentivizing people to go back to work. So this is part of their process of kind of trying to move people into the right direction to work. So the time for you to pursue these opportunities is now. So by all means, pick up the phone to your local job readiness center to find out more information. And lastly, again, I can't stress enough, the communicating and the collaborating, the coordinating between community partners, it takes a village. You cannot do this on your own. It definitely, particularly when you are talking about a population of people who have so many other barriers and challenges is, I know a lot of nonprofit agencies try to have a one-stop shop where they're doing the substance abuse, doing the anger management, doing the counseling, doing the mental health, and that's great. But it still takes a village of people. There are so many people who have been displaced, so many people who have been impacted, particularly with this with COVID-19. There are so many things that happened last year, and there's so many people that need help. And then you have a lot of people that they have a number of barriers. It is impossible to do this on your own. You will need help. You will need to communicate with people. You will need to work with other people in other industries, other sectors, and they will need to work with you. And that is what is going to take to really facilitate this process when we are talking about WIOA funding. And as you saw, when you do that, you can get clients enrolled in school, you can get them CDL funding, you can do a lot of things for them, and you can really help to change some lives. So if there are any other questions, please reach out to us at Medlin Workforce and Reentry Solutions at 619-335-8737. Or you can also go to www.medlinsolutions.com. We offer a number of services as it pertains to workforce development and reentry solutions. I did want to end, excuse me, with this one story quickly. One of my probably best stories is we had a client that came in through our program, and his dream was to receive his CDL. And I talked about CDL early in the class. It was his dream. This client particularly, he had served a life sentence, 27 years in prison. And so he had been out for several years, and due to the nature of his charge, which is pretty violent, he could not really find suitable employment. So we kind of worked with him. We took those steps. We did a skills assessment. We went through that process. Again, we talked about the WIOA. We wanted to see if we could get him CDL funding. So we went through the steps, the process, everything that I just talked to you about, we went through. It took a lot of paperwork, a lot of time, a lot of back and forth with the talent development specialist I was working with. But because we were communicating and working together, there was a lot of things that became more streamlined. Long story short, and for those of you who don't know, a CDL costs anywhere between $5, $6, $7,000, depending upon what school you're going to. Long story short, we went through the process. The Job Readiness Center, they decided to fund the training for him to go to school. So they funded him, he got the money, he went to school, did well in trucking school, he got a CDL, and today he is a CDL certified truck driver. He does have a wife and 3 kids, including a newborn daughter. And so not only is he able to support his family, but he's doing it with something that he enjoys doing. It was his dream job. And so by no means was it easy. There were a lot of hurdles and there were a lot of barriers, but he got through it. We got through it, and it was a process. It took close to 3 months. And to me and to this day, to see the smile on his face and to see that this individual cannot support his family, that's what WIOA does. That is what the program, the EDGE program was about. But it was that WIOA funding that really helped him get to point A and point B. So I tell you all this, be encouraged, go through the steps, go through the process of the things that I talked about in this presentation. And you may not get the CDL of your dreams, but I can promise you that you'll have better success when you take these steps. So again, it was a pleasure to be with you all today. Here are the resources that I use. And again, my program received media attention here. So if you ever want to find that, you can click on the link here and they'll give you more information. And that's all I have for today. Thank you all for joining. We would love to hear more about your feedback. So you can please go ahead by all means and tell us what you think of today's webinar by clicking on the link below. And I wish you all a very wonderful Thursday and have a wonderful weekend. Take care. Bye-bye.